So today's video is going to focus on the blood flow through the heart, how exactly valves work, and then just kind of some basics of essentially your heart pumping. If you haven't labeled your heart diagrams yet for some reason, I would go ahead and stop, label those real quick, and then turn it back on so that you know, so that you're at least familiar with these parts because that's an expectation of this video and we'll kind of refer to these parts under the assumption that you have a labeled diagram either in the vicinity with you or you've already spent time with your diagram and you know where these things are. So let's start with just almost like some basics of the heart, almost like trivia of the heart, right? So our heart is located in the thoracic cavity. It is located above the diaphragm. Here's your diaphragm right under here, right? So it's located here above the diaphragm, in the middle, essentially the middle of the thoracic cavity between the two lungs. Okay, they're between the right and the left lung. And in a little bit, we'll look at kind of the membranes that surround the heart and such that we actually talked about in the beginning of the fall semester. Okay, your heart isn't that big. It's about the size of a closed and clenched, pretty tight fist. It weighs less than a pound. And it's not nice and heart shaped, right? It's kind of flat on the top and then comes to a little bit of a point on the bottom. The top is actually called the base because it's the wider part, and the bottom is actually called the apex, kind of the opposite of what we usually see with like a triangle or something. But the wider part is the top, so that is the base, and the kind of point down there at the bottom is the apex. So the heart is divided into four basic chambers. Remember, it's always the patient's right and left, right? So we have our right atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. And so the blood will flow through these four different chambers. So let's take a look at blood flow first, and then we'll look at the valves and how we make sure that blood flow is only happening in one direction. So, on that note, blood flow does only go in one direction. It is a one way system. And so, it's a closed circuit in the sense that it's constantly looping through, but we always kind of think of it starting in that right atrium. So, blood is going to come back to the right atrium through that superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So, blood is going to go from what we call systemic circulation. Systemic circulation is out in your body, right? Your arms, your legs, your abdomen, your chest, your brain, all of those things, right? It's out in the body. So the blood is going to come from that systemic circulation. It's going to get funneled into the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, which will bring that blood back to that right atrium. So from this right atrium here, so from that right atrium, the blood is going to go through one of our one-way valves here. Okay, so it's going to go through that tricuspid valve. So through that tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. So now it's all here in this right ventricle. From that right ventricle, the blood is going to go up through the pulmonary semilunar valve. I don't think we're going to have room for all of this. So up through the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay, semi being half, lunar being moon. So as the blood passes through this half moon valve here, leading into the pulmonary trunk. So the pulmonary trunk comes up from the heart and then it's going to split. And it will split into the right and left pulmonary arteries. So that's where the blood is going to head next, to the right and left pulmonary arteries. Remember that arteries take blood away from the heart. It's not about whether the blood has oxygen or doesn't have oxygen. So the right and left pulmonary arteries, so that would be the left one, the blood will come out. It will go to the lungs So from there, it goes to the lungs, and then it's going to head back to the heart. And so as it heads back to the heart from the lungs, it's going to go back to the heart through those right and left pulmonary veins. Again, it doesn't have anything to do with oxygen or no oxygen, right? It is just about the direction of blood flow. So it's in a vein now, and the blood is flowing back into the heart, and the blood will come back into this left atrium. So from those pulmonary veins back into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it will go through that bicuspid or mitral valve. Told you we were going to get close on space here. So through that bicuspid or mitral valve into that left ventricle. Hopefully you have more room and you're making like a nice big circle. So into that left ventricle. From that left ventricle, it will pump up through another half moon or semilunar valve. So into the aortic semilunar valve, up into the aorta, and then into systemic circulation. So up through the aorta here, where then it can branch out and keep going out into the systemic circulation. Okay, so I'm going to pause this and clean this up a little bit, and then we'll talk about oxygen versus deoxygenated blood. Okay, so I've redone your circulation here so you can see it a little bit better, and then will help us hopefully talk a little bit about our oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. So as this blood is returning through that superior vena cava, that inferior vena cava into that right atrium, that blood has very low oxygen levels. So here, the blue are going to be low oxygen levels. These are going to be higher oxygen levels. So it has very low oxygen levels because it's been taking oxygen out to your tissues and it's coming back. And so as it goes through that tricuspid valve, still low oxygen, the right ventricle, you'll notice the wall of the right ventricle isn't nearly as thick as the wall to the left ventricle because it just has to pump the blood out to the lungs. So it contracts, pumps that blood up through that pulmonary semilunar valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries out to the lungs. At the lungs is where the blood will pick up more oxygen. So the blood is picking up more oxygen. And so now it's going to head back to the heart, now all nice and full of oxygen. So this is the instance where veins are carrying a high oxygen blood because it's bringing blood back to the heart, because that's our definition of a vein. Artery away from the heart, vein toward the heart. So that high oxygen blood is headed back to the left atrium. The left ventricle will then do a big contractions with its bigger, stronger muscle, pump that blood up through that aortic semilunar valve, out through the aorta so it can get everywhere in your body. So it can get out to the brain, down to your toes, out to your fingertips. And the blood can go through that systemic circulation. And as the blood is going out to the tissues and coming back, it's dropping off oxygen and it's coming back with less oxygen so it can then get pumped through the heart again to go pick up more oxygen. Okay, so let's look at these valves for a second. You can see the valves in your cross section here. You can see the valves in this diagram up here. These valves, again, help make this blood stay a one-way flow. So what happens with these valves is, and we're going to do a lab where we kind of build valves. So I want you to be pretty comfortable with how they work. So what happens with these valves is that the valves are basically all shaped like this. And so when blood goes through them, it can easily push them open. But if blood tries to go backwards, it actually ends up smushing the valve together. So now the blood is closed. Now the blood has forced the valve shut and it pushes it closed. Okay? And so that's how those valves are going to act as a one-way situation, right? That because of them being built like this, when the blood comes through, that can force them open, right? I can force this valve open with the pressure of the blood going through. But when blood tries to come backwards like this, it actually catches on these flaps and these sides, and the result is the valve ends up shutting like that. And all the valves will work like that. If you look at so those are your atrioventricular valves. If you look at those semilunar valves, you'll see that they're shaped like this. So again, if I force blood up through there, then I'll get a gap, right? And they'll open and the blood can go through there. If I have blood that tries to come backwards, like in the aorta, right? I've got blood that's trying to come up and then fall back down and go backwards. It'll pool in these like little cups here, and that will actually seal it shut. It'll push those flaps together and seal it shut. Okay, so the wall of the heart is made of muscle, cardiac muscle. We've looked at it under the microscope a few times. A myocardium is what that wall of the heart is made of. Okay, so the wall of the heart has 3 layers. It has an endocardium layer. So this is going to be the inside of the heart, the actual chambers. So this is the inside of a ventricle, and the inside of an atrium. I'd say with the thickness of this wall, this is an inside of a ventricle. And then you have this thick, large, so you have the endocardium layer that's coming in actual contact with the blood. And then you have this thick, large muscle layer. And then we have the pericardium on the outside. We're not going to worry about the fibrous pericardium part, but if you look, hopefully these look familiar. A parietal pericardium and this epicardium is what we would have called visceral pericardium. Remember, this was a serous membrane. So serous there in this pericardial cavity, right? There's going to be that serous fluid so that every time the heart beats and moves and changes shape, this thin layer of fluid in here allows for friction to be really reduced, right? There's no catching or grabbing or snagging. It's going to be there's going to be this serous fluid layer that allows the visceral pericardium to slide smoothly across that parietal pericardium. Okay, and the last 2 things that we are going to want to talk about here are cardiac output as well as the cardiac cycle. So the cardiac cycle is basically made up of 2 parts, what we call diastole versus systole. So diastole is when the ventricles are going to relax. And so if the ventricles are relaxing, that means the atria are contracting. And if you kind of picture your heart here, right, you've got your 4 basic chambers, right? Atria, atrium, ventricle, ventricle. The atria has gravity going with it, right? As the blood flows from the atrium to the ventricle, so it's got gravity going with it. It doesn't have a far distance to go. So the atria have very, very little muscle. They don't need to do big, powerful contractions, right? That blood doesn't need to go very far. The left ventricle has by far the greatest muscle because it's trying to pump blood throughout your body. And the right ventricle has kind of like medium amount of muscle. So the ventricle during diastole, the ventricles are nice and relaxed. Okay. And so what's happening during this time is the ventricles are filling, right? And so the atria are contracting or pumping. And so what's happening during this time is blood is moving from the atria to the ventricle. During systole, the ventricles are contracting and the atria are relaxed. So what's happening during this phase is when the ventricles are contracting here, we're pumping blood out into the pulmonary trunk to go to the lungs, or out into the aorta to go to the rest of the body. And the ventricles will contract at the same time. So you'll be pumping blood to your lungs at the same time you're pumping blood up to out to the rest of the body. The right and left don't like take turns contracting. Okay, and our cardiac output. So our cardiac output is going to be the amount of blood that is pumped out by the heart in 1 minute. And this is a lot. It's actually measured in liters per minute. So you pump a lot of blood per minute. And you calculate this by multiplying our stroke volume times our heart rate. Stroke volume times the heart rate. So stroke volume is going to be the amount of blood that's pumped in one beat. Let's put pumped in there so we don't get confused. So the amount of blood pumped in one beat. And then our heart rate is going to be our number of beats per minute. And so when I multiply those two together, I get my total cardiac output, which is going to be the amount of blood your heart is able to pump and move, okay, over the course of 1 minute. Okay, and this is important as we're measuring heart health, right? Is our heart functioning efficiently, and am I getting enough blood to be able to circulate throughout my body, to be able to get the nutrients and oxygen to those other tissues so that they survive. Okay, so we're gonna, this is gonna kind of our basic heart stuff. We'll have one other set of heart notes on kind of electrical conduction through the heart and EKGs. Okay, and then that will be, in addition to labeling of the heart, that will be the end of your heart information.